be about 30 minutes, yeah. I try to time it so we don't just get cut off, but there's no one to cue us or anything like that. So
You just got to do it yourself.
yeah, well, no, but you're writing about writer.
Yeah.
You did read poetry today, though, didn't you?
Well, what I read, there's some parts of the book that I think sort of have a poetic thing to them. I was reading from the book when I did it.
Good afternoon. My name is Doug Holder. I'm with my guest, Steve Eddington, today. We're going to be discussing his new book, The Beat Face of God, that examines the spirituality of the beat generation of writers who were prevalent in the 50s and early 60s, notably Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, and other figures. Just a few announcements before we speak to my guest. May 6th, this Saturday, the Grow Your Poetry Bookshop has been taken over by a gentleman who I interviewed on this show, Ifeanyi Menkidi. He's a Wellesley College philosophy professor and poet, and he's taken over the famous Grow Your Poetry bookstore right in Harvard Square at, I believe it's 4 or 6 Plimpton Street, right behind the Harvard bookstore. And he's opening it up. It's going to be open up to international poets, and he's really going to keep it a vibrant and also a new direction to it as well. So please come there. He's looking for suggestions and support. June 10th, Ibbotson 19 reading at McIntyre Moore at 3 p.m., free, open mic. We'll hope you'll attend for that reading for a new issue of the Somerville Ibbotson Street Press. Good afternoon, Steve.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me down.
I met Steve at the Squawk Coffee House at what church is that again?
The Epworth, I think it's a Methodist church just off of Harvard Square there.
Harvard Epworth. Yeah, your
Methodist
church.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in the beats, and some 30 years ago when I was like 20 years old, I picked up On the Road, and I was thrilled. And some 40 years ago, you picked it up, and you were very influenced. So all generations, all ages, it still has an effect. So I really want to speak to Steve. The book, The Beat Face of God, is an exploration of some of the underlying spiritual and religious currents found in the writings and lives of a loose American after World War II, and came to be known as the Beat Generation writers. Among the more prominent figures were Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, Allen Ginsberg, known for Howl, William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, Gary Snyder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Coney Island of the Mind, and City Light Bookstore, to name just a few. Writing from the perspective of a liberal religious minister, Unitarian Universalist, and a Beat Generation scholar, Reverend Steve Eddington expands upon and delves into Jack Kerouac's contention that the Beat Generation was a religious generation. These writers and poets, each in his or her own way, were articulating and set forth an alternative spirituality in the prevailing cultural ethos of America of the 1950s. Mr. Eddington, as we said, is I should say Dr. Eddington?
No, I never quite got that far.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Reverend Eddington is the minister of the Unitarian Universal Church in Nashua, New Hampshire. He's a member of the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Committee and an adjunct faculty member of the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, thanks.
Now, Steve, you are a universal minister.
Unitarian
Universal.
It's a big word.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. 11 syllables.
Now, how does being a religious leader fit with your interest in beat literature that often glorifies drugs, promiscuity, and things not usually associated with the quote-unquote religious life?
Well, maybe I back up just a little bit. Writing the book was really a way to bring together sort of two of the worlds that I move around in. One being, as you said, a Unitarian Universalist minister. Unitarian Universalism is a very liberal form of Protestantism. And then my other interest in the beats that I've had ever since I was in theological school in the late 1960s. And where I saw the two of them coming together was actually and I mentioned this in the book, definition of religion that one of my colleagues in the UU ministry, the Reverend Forrest Church, has offered, which he says it's our human response / sort of wording, but our human response to the dual reality of being alive and knowing that we will die. In other words, it is how we find meaning and purpose and depth in life in the face of our mortality. And I really took a look at the writings of the Beats and decided that that was what they were really trying to do. That was the kind of quest that they were on.
In fact,
above and beyond some of the more self-destructive kinds of behavior that they engaged in.
And Kerouac actually articulated that.
Yeah, Kerouac said the Beat generation is a religious generation. When he was on the Steve Allen show and was asked why he wrote the book, he said, well, I wrote the book because we're all going to die, which probably caught a lot of people off guard, but I think what he really meant by that was harking back to that definition of religion I just offered, is I wrote this book in the face of my mortality, and how do I find some kind of a meaning in the life that I have for the length of time that I have to live it. And so while I think see, there's sort of two topographies in On the Road. One is the America of the late 1940s of Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy, but the inner topography is really the soul of Kerouac in the person of Sal Paradise, trying to answer the question of who am I and where do I belong, and what kinds of things really matter to me. And so I think when Kerouac was asked on that radio program after the publication of On the Road, he said, "What are you looking for?" I guess he was probably interviewed in a setting about like this one, although it was radio. And he said, "I'm waiting." He says, "I want God to show me His face," which is where I got the title.
So I mean, nothing is black or white. Everything, there are shades of gray. And so you chose this. There, even though there are a lot of like we all have a lot of bad sides to us.
Sure.
We all have skeletons. So you chose to pick the things that you were interested in. You think were more laudable.
Right. I tried to.
You never advocate that.
I don't.
Would you advocate? I mean, if a young person came to you and said, "Hit the road and do drugs and and run around."
No. I have a 22-year-old son, and I've raised him all along, and I want him to have an interest and appreciation for some of the writings and some of the works of these people. I would not want him to emulate some of the ways in which they chose to live. It's interesting. He's 22 years old. He's got one more year of college to go. So this summer, the gas prices don't get to him. He and his friend decided they were going to drive around the country in August. And I thought, well, how can I say no to this? He's been hearing the talk Kerouac On the Road all my life, and now he wants to do his own road trip. But no, I mean, you raise a good point. I would not advocate, like I said, engaging in some of the kind of self-destructive behavior these people did. But I would say try to look at what they were really looking for. Try to look at what they were searching for. They were trying to find some kind of, as I say, meaning and purpose and depth in life against the backdrop of what they saw was the real, the sort of cultural conformity of the 1950s.
Well, I know, and the reason I bring it up is because of like Bukowski and other poets that sort of romanticize, or even Plath and Sexton, about their mental illness and the craziness and the drinking and the drugging, and so often poets starting out say, I got to do that. This is part of being a poet, and it's not. I mean, it doesn't have to be.
No, and I try to speak to that. I've got a chapter in here. I think it's called Divine Madness, Demonic Madness, and the Holy. And I try to draw that kind of a distinction between. And I talk about Ginsberg and Kerouac in there, and I think Kerouac eventually, for all of his creative writing types of all the kinds of gifts he had, as far as back, he eventually succumbed to divine madness, demonic madness. I think Ginsberg, on the other hand, even having to deal with the mental illness of his mother that eventually claimed her life, he was able to see the kind of demonic madness in his mother and walk through that to where he encountered what I think was a kind of a divine madness, especially when he got into the Buddhist practice in his life at a later point in his life. Yeah.
Now, would you consider Kerouac, Ginsberg, and I guess you would in a way, and people of their ilk, as if someone said, are they religious people? You would say?
I would say so. Well,
I mean, Kerouac was a tortured Catholic.
He was a lifelong Catholic. He was born a Catholic, was given a Catholic burial when he died. Right. He never, for all of his issues and battles with certain points of Catholic doctrine, he never renounced his Catholicism. Right. You read Visions of Gerard, which he wrote clear up, I think, in 1956. He's trying to embrace his Catholicism on the one hand and say sort of where he's got his issues with it on the other. He went through a very heavy Buddhist phase in his life in the early 1950s, but in the end he came back to and embraced his Catholicism.
But he was sort of tortured by his Catholicism.
Well, yes, he was. Yeah. It was one of those things where it was all I think he was very both captivated and tortured by the idea of the suffering Jesus. you see some of the artwork that he did throughout his life, and it's predominantly crosses and crucifixes and Jesus being there was something about that suffering that both attracted him and, as you said, caused him a real struggle.
And Ginsberg, I know, in Kaddish and other of his poems. I mean, he was a Buddhist primarily, but I mean, that you can't deny that the strong influence of Judaism in his poetry.
Oh, yeah.
How was he? How did he deal with his Judaism? Do you think?
Well, I think he went a little easier with himself on his Judaism than Kerouac did with his Catholicism. Again, I don't think Ginsberg ever renounced his Judaism. He just kind of added Buddhism he just added Buddhism onto it. I mean,
a little curry in the chopped liver, right?
Yeah, right. No, that poem Kaddish. Kaddish means a Jewish prayer for the dead.
Right.
That whole thing.
Dust to dust, ashes to ashes.
It's an incredibly moving poem.
It is.
You can't read the thing without.
Actually, I like it better than Hal.
Yeah, I think he put more. I think he put more into that than he did Hal. It's impossible to read parts of that or hear it read almost without weeping at times. Where he talks about going to this as a young man and seeing his mother and the condition that she was in, and I think in some ways Ginsberg took the madness that he saw in his mother and extended that in a way to some of the madness that he saw in the society that he was dealing with. And it's like, how do you counter this kind of demonic madness, from the madness of my mother to the madness of a society that's building atomic bombs? And his counter to that was divine madness. I mean, if you read Howl, the first parts of it are just, it's like a walk through hell.
Right. Hysterical streets of dawn.
People who did this and who did that. But you get to what he calls a footnote to Howl, and it's holy. Holy is this, holy is that, holy the sidewalks, holy. So it's like Howl is basically a walk through the demonic in search of the holy. And I think that's what the Beats were also trying to do. They were walking through, or looking at what they considered to be some of the more demonic aspects of the society that they were in, but they were looking for some kind of a holy or sacred or divine dimension to life. I think that's what the Beat quest was, at least in part, was about. Yeah.
Now, in 1948, Jack Kerouac, the author of On the Road, wrote, "In America today, there's a claw hanging over our brains." Was that a claw?
Claw, C-L-A-W.
Claw hanging over, which must be pushed aside, else it will clutch and strangle our real selves. Now, this is in the 1940s. Do you think that's still true today?
Well, that's why I built my last chapter of this book around that quote, which has only recently come to light. It just that came out in a book called Windblown World: The Journals of Jack Kerouac, which has only been published in the last 2 or 3 years, edited by Douglas Brinkley, who's a historian who's working on what will eventually be the authorized biography of Kerouac. So yeah, he wrote that. It's kind of funny, the context for that. He's out in California, he's in Marin County, and he's writing all this pastoral kinds of things about the ocean and the sky and the cows in the field. And in the middle of all that, you get this line about, in America today, there's a claw hanging over our brains, which must be pushed aside, else it will clutch and strangle our real selves. And when I read that, it was like one of those lines that jumped off the page and grabbed me. And I thought, well, what was the claw that he was seeing in 1948, and what is the claw that we're looking at, the claw on our brains that we're looking at right now? And I don't know what was in Kerouac's mind when he wrote that, but it seemed to me that some of the claws that I've gotten there that are clutching us right now, as I say, are the claws of consumerism and anti-terrorism. And when I say anti-terrorism, I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about people who want to do us harm, because they are there. But I think the fear of terrorism is doing as bad a number on us as
the Cold War was.
As the Cold War, as the terrorists were themselves. And I think I mentioned this. I said the place where I saw those 2 claws coming.
So sort of like McCarthyism and Bushism. I mean,
similar. Well, you can draw that comparison. What I say in there, I say I saw the twin claws as being consumerism and anti-terrorism. I said, I think in the aftermath of 9/11, one of the things the president said to show that we were not going to be defeated by the terrorists, he says, "Go shopping." Well, there it comes together.
Actually, the mayor said that.
Was it Giuliani who said that?
He
said, "Go shopping."
Oh, no, maybe you're right. Maybe it was him.
But I thought, well, there it is. Coming together.
Go shopping,
coming together right there.
I shop, therefore I am, right?
That seems to be the thing. So, as I've said in some of this, you mentioned I do a class on the Beats. In some ways,
at Lowell, right?
At UMass Lowell, I'm doing a little
similar type of course at Riviera College in Nashua right now. I think the backdrop they were writing against was a country that, for all kinds of understandable reasons, wanted to get back to normal after first the Depression, then a Second World War. You'd had all this upheaval. And so the idea was, let's settle down, fly right, kind of put a veneer on all that's gone over the last 15 years. And the Beats were, as I call them, holy misfits. They were the people who could not fit with where the culture was going at that time. They were the ones who were trying to probe beneath that.
Who are the modern day Beats, if you had to say?
I have a hard time.
I mean, how about is there groups and
No, I think it's become much more. I find them I can't think of any big names I would put on it. I find it more in, well, like the poetry reading you and I were at. I find it more on just a local level right now of poets, young poets, finding their venues, finding their places to speak. Yeah, when I go looking for who the Beats are today, I go to a place like Squawk. Or is Jack Kerouac still doing the Stone Soup
he's still doing
around
that.
here? I go to just small venues like that, and that's where I mostly see it coming from. I see it in the poetry slams we have at the Kerouac Festival up in Lowell every fall. I've been on the committee that puts that on, and go to high schools and see these high school kids read. It's really powerful stuff.
Now, that's going to lead me into the next question. Tell me about the Kerouac Celebration Law and your involvement in the committee that organizes this event. You did tell me just before the show started the scroll that Kerouac wrote on is going to be displayed at the Kerouac Festival. Is that it?
Right. Yeah.
Now, tell us what's the scroll and what's that about, and people don't know.
What is referred to as the scroll is a 120-foot roll of paper that Jack Kerouac wrote the original version of the original manuscript on the road on. I believe it was in April of 1950.
Now that's religious, isn't it, like a Torah? Or something?
Yeah, it's got this sort of religious thing to it. I've seen it.
Did he do that consciously?
I don't know. I think no, well, actually, the reason, which I think is probably true, he was a stream of consciousness writer, and he was a speed typist. He could have done wonders with word processors. So he figured the next best thing. The reason he did the reason he wrote it the way he did
was automatic writing, like Wolfe, like Thomas.
Yeah, he was using a manual typewriter. What he didn't want to do was to have to break his chain of thinking. When he could type so fast, he could fill up a page of paper probably in a couple of minutes. So what he didn't want to have to do was when he got to the end of each paper, remember this is a manual typewriter, he didn't want to have to crank the page out, put it down, put another one in,
he just wanted to keep going.
He just wanted to keep going. So he just strung all this paper together.
Was he sort of like a mania almost? Writing, a mania of writing.
Benzodrine and coffee for 3 weeks. and he wrote the original manuscript to on the road, using all the original names of the people. He was just, he wasn't trying to change the names or anything like that. Long story, which I don't have a whole lot of time for. It basically sat in a safe for a number of years. In the spring of 2001, for a number of reasons, the Kerouac estate felt they needed to sell it, probably to settle some estate taxes.
Did they want to sell it to Harvard and they turned him down or something?
I'm not sure what the story is on that, but what they ended up doing was offer Christie's auction, put it on sale, and it sold for $2.4 million.
Wow.
Guy that bought it was James Irsay, who owns the Indianapolis Colts. And he's all in Indianapolis. He's also a collector of pop cultural memorabilia. He's got Elvis guitar and a Jerry Garcia guitar and that kind of thing. And Irsay, to his credit, the fear was among people like myself and a lot of other sort of Kerouac aficionados, were that somebody was going to buy it and put it in their private library somewhere and use it to impress their friends. Irsay, to his credit, arranged for it, or has arranged for it, to be on display at various venues around the United States. And it's a fascinating thing to see. I saw it when it was on display at Marquette University in Milwaukee. It's in a big, long, aluminum-built case about as wide as this desk here with plexiglass over it, and you can look and see the original manuscript.
Which brings me to an interesting question. I mean, if I was, now I hear that there's, if I was a scholar of Kerouac, and, I hear there are two libraries, the Columbia has and Stanford. Are those the two big libraries now that have the archives of Beat and Kerouac?
Actually, Stanford has Ginsberg. Actually, the New York Public Library has the Kerouac archive.
Now, isn't that interesting? Because Kerouac attended Columbia, and a lot of the Beats did. So why doesn't Columbia?
Well, I don't know. I don't think Columbia's ever really. None of the Beats graduated. Ginsberg and Kerouac both went there. They dropped out before they finished. Stanford was just interested in Ginsberg's papers, paid him $1 million for it several years before he died. But the New York Public Library has the entire Kerouac archive, which, as I understand, will be available for the folks like me to come and look at. After Doug Brinkley gets the first crack at it, and then after he's written his biography, my understanding is that it will be available for the public. Just to finish one thing on the scroll, it's going to be on display in Lowell, Massachusetts, summer of 2007, at the Boot Cotton Mill Museum, which is in the Lowell Historic National Park. And somehow or other, I got myself named the project manager for the committee or the group that's working on this exhibit.
Good for
So
you.
we're hoping to bring scholars together, people whose lives have been influenced by Kerouac, as well as local poets, writers. We want to make that whole summer of 2007.
Well, I mean, I'm a local poet. How would I get involved for our local
Well,
poets?
you let our program committee know you're interested, and we'll find a place for you. But we want to make that
and how
whole
would
summer.
one contact you guys?
Okay. Best way to reach us is through, this thing is being coordinated through what's called the COOL office in Lowell. COOL is an acronym for Cultural Organization of Lowell.
Okay.
So if you go www.cultureiscool.org, and then there's a place on that website.
www.cultureiscool.org. One word,
cultureiscool.org. And then there'll be a section on there where it'll say something like Kerouac exhibit or Kerouac scroll exhibit. And you click into that. And
Do you have a phone number for people who don't have a computer access?
Not at the moment. If I can
Okay.
get one out, I'll let you know, and you can maybe put it out in a later broadcast.
And then just before I forget, I mean, we still have time, but I mean, how would one order your book,
Well,
The Beat Face of God?
It can be ordered through the publisher, which is Trafford Publishing. But the best way is you can just order it from me.
Yeah.
Again, through Beat Face of God, all one word, Beat Face of God at Hotmail.
Or Amazon?
Or you can order through Amazon. It's available through Amazon.
Is it available in any
directly from me.
bookstores? Or?
It's available. I'm still trying to get into some bookstores. I found
That's a
Trafford
big
is a
nut to
print-on-demand
crack, yeah.
company, and so when you
Yeah.
work with one of those people, you kind of have to go out and hustle the bookstores to do it yourself. So I got a little packet of information. I've been mailing out letters and samples to bookstores, and some of them are beginning to pick it up and carry it.
I imagine at the festival would be a hot number.
Oh yeah. And at the Kerouac Festival, I did a signing at the Barnes and Noble in Lowell during the Kerouac Festival, and it went well there. Yeah.
Now, let's see. Of the beat writers such as Kerouac, Burroughs, Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, Corso, etc., who speaks to you the loudest?
Well, Kerouac does, but we've been talking a lot
Yeah.
about him. I'm going to switch to the West Coast because I think
Yeah.
there's sort of a whole. We think of the beats. There was the East Coast contingent was the birth of the beats. The scene is when Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs all met each other in 1944, kind of on the Upper West Side around Columbia University. There's a West Coast version of that too, which says it's when Ferlinghetti and Gary Snyder and Michael McClure and Philip Whalen and some of those folks began finding one another in the early 1950s, and their coming out party, so to speak, was a reading place called Gallery 6, or 6 Gallery, in October of 1955.
When
Ginsberg
Howe
was
was
that.
read?
That was when
Yeah.
Howe was read for the first time,
Right.
and that was kind of the West Coast part. Actually, the person who, setting Kerouac aside, I'd say the person who still speaks to you the most is Ferlinghetti. I've got a chapter in here on Ferlinghetti because I think he's a fascinating guy.
Did you see him up here?
I didn't see him here, but I have met him a few times on some of my trips to
Ferlinghetti, he lasted, but he didn't get involved in all the drugs and the sort of stuff. He lived a pretty straight life.
He was a businessman too.
He was a businessman.
He opened up the City Lights bookstore,
Yeah.
the City Lights Publishing, so he was running that. You got to stay fairly sober
Yeah,
to do that kind of thing.
You do.
And he's become sort of the grand old man of the whole. I mean, he's in his late 80s,
Yeah.
still going strong. You're right. He was here in Cambridge a couple weeks ago to get an award.
And people tell me he looks great.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen him a couple of times on some of my trips to the West Coast, and he's such an amazing kind of. Here's a guy who was a part of he was a submarine chaser for the Navy during the D-Day invasion,
Wow.
Second World War. Grew up in Yonkers, New York, was an Eagle Scout, and. But according to him, his transformative experience was being in Nagasaki shortly after the atomic bomb was dropped.
Oh, really?
And he realized the potential for destruction that human beings had, and that was he still considers that to be sort of his defining experience, and that was what told him.
And plus, he was an academic.
He was an academic,
At the
yes.
University of Paris or something? Yeah.
Sorbonne,
Sorbonne.
PhD from the Sorbonne. So he's just an incredible guy. So in terms of the sort of who's my main beat right now, I'd have to say it's Ferlinghetti. And his poetry is wonderful. It's got this very delightful kind of whimsical quality to it.
Yeah,
and then with
series on dogs.
that'll just zap you.
Yeah.
It's like you're
Like, I remember in the Coney Island of Mind, he has a series of poems on the dog. The dog walks the street.
Right,
It's very
right,
interesting.
right.
Yeah.
Well, my favorite poem of his is, I think it's called "The World's a Beautiful Place."
Yeah.
For doing all these things. The world's a beautiful place if you don't mind a few people dying some of the time. The world's a beautiful, go into all
Right,
these
right,
sort of
right.
poetic, fun kinds of things, and then I think the last line is something like, "But in the middle of it all comes the smiling mortician."
Yeah.
Back to that thing about.
Yeah.
Back to
Find
that
some
definition
meaning,
of
right,
religion
right,
about
right. Finding meaning in
finding a
spite-
meaning in life, knowing that we're going to die, and he's going,
Yeah.
"The world's a beautiful place to do da 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 da," and then comes the smiling mortician. In other words, you've only got so much time to
Do something.
really engage and to really celebrate all these kinds of things. And that's what the Beats were doing. I think they were looking for, what can we celebrate? What can we hold up? What
Right.
can we affirm in the face of our in
our
the face of our
demise.
mortality? Yeah.
Now, do you see any? Well, we discussed that. Is on the road and beat literature in general writing that can be best appreciated when we're young or when we're middle aged? I mean, is it basically a young person's stuff?
Well, in a way it is. I found that if I read, I probably first read On the Road when I was in my early 20s, I guess.
Same here. Yeah.
You read it at different stages of your life,
Right,
and you
right.
see different things. You read it in your 20s, and it's like, wow, that's great. That'd be the
It's
great
thrilling.
thing to do. Janet.
It's absolutely thrilling. I
Janis
remember that.
Joplin
Yeah, right,
said
right,
that
yeah.
she was living in Port Arthur, Texas, and she read On the Road, and that was what caused her to run off to San
Right.
Francisco and all that. There's an undertone, though, of sadness in that book,
Which you understand later.
which you read it a little bit later, and you see that there's also a counterpoint to this sort of the joy and the excitement and the exuberance of it. There's also an undertone of sadness and tragedy, which Kerouac was even picking up on when he was in his 20s.
Right.
And he wrote the book. How old was he when he wrote the book? He was 28 years old
Yeah.
when